Thanks for the reminder. I'm going to start recording here. All right. I think we'll get started pretty soon. Hope everyone had a good weekend. Anyone have anything exciting happen over the weekend? Will, maybe?
Yeah. We submitted an offer for the new construction in Pittsburgh and it was accepted. It's my first. Yay.
Nice. Congratulations, Will.
Thank you.
Yeah, Will.
Yay. Yeah.
How's it feel?
Hey, where there's a will, there's a way.
There's a way, yes. Thanks. Yeah, it was awesome. Started showing homes with him as soon as I got my e-key. That was October 9th, so it's been 4 weeks, and we found something he loves, and yeah, I'm super excited for his new journey, and he can create new memories with this new home. So I'm super excited. I'm very happy.
Is this the same Pittsburgh buyer that you submit your first offer for?
Yes, the same buyer. And so what happened was yesterday we went to see two more homes. There were older homes, and I was pushing him to see the new construction because I kind of knew that he doesn't like old things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like I'm glad that I pushed him a little bit, like a couple times. And then once he's get to compare those two homes like side by side within 15 minutes, he realized that what he wanted is the new home.
Nice. That's cool.
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of good lessons there because I'm sure you were a little bit bummed when that offer didn't get accepted, but it just means you're closer to the next one and to getting an offer accepted. And I like what you were saying too about kind of pushing the buyer based on, you're the expert at the end of the day in helping people find homes. And when you take the input that they give you and you start to kind of figure out what might be best for them, sometimes buyers really need a little bit of a nudge, and most of them are kind of counting on you to give them that advice based on the input they're giving you. So I think it's good that you nudged them along what you ultimately thought would be best for them, and it worked out. So congratulations. And it's exciting with new construction because there's not a whole lot that can go wrong. So not that I want to jinx you, but is it a unit that's already complete, or is it where is it in as far as the where is it like built?
Yeah, so it will be done by the end of December. We've seen I took him to this new construction like 2 weeks ago too, and they're building really fast. So the finishes, the floor were upgraded because this is the new home that they wanted to sell before December, so they could start a new phase, I guess. Yeah, so everything is picked, and he loved what they picked, like the tile or the floor, countertop, everything. So it's just perfect timing for him, and we got a really good deal too because like the seller is really want to push it and close it.
Nice. Well, good job, man. I'm sure you'll have to talk about that on tomorrow's meeting too. So
yeah, of course. Thanks.
Just get you warmed up a little bit.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's jump into it. Hope those of you that were here last week enjoyed the deep dive into the residential purchase agreement. I recorded that one and it's going to be posted in Slack today. I'm just lagging a little bit. That'll be a good thing to refer back to just really, if you have questions about particular paragraphs and all that. But, like I was saying last week, you really can get a lot out of, so as it sounds, you can get a lot out of just reading through the document, reading it out loud, reading it a couple times. It looks more daunting than it is, but when you read through it, it tends to make more sense than you might think at first. So residential purchase agreement, obviously a big deal. Today, we're going to go through some of the additional forms that are going to come up in a transaction. Not all of these will always come up. Some of them apply to certain situations that might not come up in every transaction, like the seller needing a rent back, or your buyers having a contingency on the property of the sale, or how many, there could be one addendum in a transaction or 5. So there are some forms obviously that you're going to use every single time, and there are some forms that will come up just as the circumstances dictate. So we're going to go through the commonly used ones today. There might be some that come up in your next transaction that we didn't hit today, and obviously we can always we're always available to make sure you understand every form. And again, like a key lesson in this whole thing is just make sure you understand what you're having your buyers sign, because it is, it's part of a binding contract. So you want to make sure that if you're advising them on something and they're going to be signing a form that's going to affect the transaction, that you really understand what they're signing, because they're relying on you for advice in what these forms are actually doing and what they actually mean when you incorporate them in the transaction. So last week, before we jump into the forms, last week I kind of gave a quick overview of zip forms. And before we jump into today's forms, I want to give a quick overview of SkySlope. So zip forms was the forms library. It's going to kind of where you're going to virtually manage all the paperwork that goes along with the transactions. SkySlope is kind of the back end, and it's what you use to communicate with the broker, who's ultimately responsible for making sure that your file and the transaction and all the documentation that's part of the transaction, the broker is ultimately responsible for making sure that you have the required documents based on what's in the transaction, on record. So SkySlope is a transaction management platform that the key purpose of it is to communicate, to all parties on your side that you have all the form, and it helps you organize the forms. But even more so in zip forms, because the most important part of SkySlope are the checklists, and there are certain documents that are going to be required by the broker. So there's SkySlope checklists for the transactions, and they're custom made for EXP, and they have all of the forms that EXP requires in the checklist. So if you haven't had a chance to look at SkySlope yet, or you haven't done a transaction, there's just a couple screenshots. So on the left side, SkySlope has like the overview of the transaction. So you obviously want to make sure that all that stuff's accurate, like the sales price, the projected close date, the parties involved, all of that, the key dates, the acceptance date, which triggers all the other timelines. And then there's the checklist here that I was talking about. So it'll go through and it'll be based on different parts of the transaction, and it'll have these, it's really easy to read because it has these status markers. And basically if there's, you don't want, this is a transaction that's closed. So you don't want to see any red in here, because if there's red, that means you're missing documents. Sometimes they're missing because they haven't been uploaded. But either way, you want to check the checklist, because if you're missing documentation and you're getting close to the close of escrow, it's super important that everything is signed and submit prior to close of escrow. And then on the right side here, you'll see you get some updates through your email, and these are going to go to your EXP email. So if you just make sure that you have your EXP email forwarded to the email you actually check, because I don't think many of us are using that email we got from EXP. So I have a filter on my EXP email where anything that mentions SkySlope gets sent to my primary email, just so I make sure that I see it. So because periodically they'll go in here on the EXP side and do file review, and that's when they update the status of everything, and that's where you'll see if something's missing. So when you get a file review email, you can go through and basically just scroll down and look for the red. And if the red is something that you have, it might just be maybe your transaction coordinator didn't get it, or they didn't upload it. You didn't get it to your transaction coordinator, or they forgot to upload it. Transaction coordinators are pretty organized, so chances are if something's missing, it's probably, at least in my case, I don't want to speak for everyone, but usually if something's missing that we have, chances are it's because I forgot to send it to the transaction coordinator or copy them on it, and not that the transaction coordinator forgot to email it. And that just kind of is a good spot to talk about transaction coordinators in general and how they fit in the transaction. They do exactly what their title implies. They coordinate the transaction. Some agents really are good and fine doing the paperwork side on themselves. Other agents, it's super cumbersome, and you're not going to do as good a job anyway. So we have transaction coordinators available that you can pay to facilitate basically all of the paperwork. And for me, it's not just they're making my life easier by sending out the DocuSigns and keeping the forms organized. They are they handle a ton of transactions, so they know specific things that are required in specific cities. So if I try to do files myself, I might not realize that this city has some random weatherization disclosure, or this city has an extra ordinance that needs to be signed. So the transaction coordinators, in my opinion, are really worth the money for a lot of reasons. They're going to keep your files a lot more organized and stay on top of it, and they're going to make sure that you don't miss anything. And they're a really important connection between you and the EXP side in making sure that your file is compliant and has everything, because basically if you're missing a bunch of stuff before the file's closed, it's going to take you longer to get paid on it. And obviously, we got to wait through the whole escrow anyway to get our check. The worst is when your file is incomplete, and it's a problem when you're a couple of days away from closing. So having a transaction coordinator just keeps you on top of your file, does a lot of the legwork for you as far as getting signatures and keeping it organized, and they'll stay on top of the compliance and file management side of the transaction, so you can just focus on working with your client, make sure they're comfortable with everything, and you work together on just getting the file complete.
Just a little tip there to add to what John's saying is you want to make sure that your TC is the person that's primarily in SkySlope. You don't want to have a bunch of different versions of things going back and forth. It can get really confusing. This is kind of like your final, version of things. And I know with Kelly, she prefers to be the one in SkySlope dealing with this stuff directly, and you just email her the paperwork. Other TCs have different protocol, but just, they're the ones that should be uploading this stuff in theirs to make sure that it's actually the right version.
Yeah, exactly. And I literally I logged in a SkySlope to take the screenshot, but I, throughout the course of a transaction, will never log in a SkySlope because, only one person needs to be updating it. The TC is a lot more on top of everything as far as knowing where the file's at and keeping the files organized. Like if you saw my desktop, it's just like a hot mess of documents and download folders. I just rely on the TC to keep it organized. So there really, if you're in SkySlope doing stuff, it should be something that you've worked out with your TC, but most TCs prefer to just be the primary person dealing with it. Kelly, if you haven't had a chance to use her, Kelly's like the team TC. She's amazing. I've worked with a few different TCs, and really most TCs are pretty good, because if you're not good, you're not going to make it. But Kelly is super on top of it. If anything, she's like too on top of it, and is so timely with things that I'll forget to mention stuff to my client, and she's like already sending it over because she's really sticking to the timeline. So highly recommend Kelly. Without TCs, my files would be a mess, and I would never get paid. So seems like a good time to just kind of address all of that as part of the training, because it obviously goes along with the forms. So these checklists, again, just to wrap it all up, these checklists are key that you pay attention to these throughout a transaction, because they're going to tell you if you're missing stuff and you need to go back and get things signed. All right. So for the rest of the time, we're pretty much just going to go through the forms like we did last week. Obviously, the RPA is a 10-page form, and it's really, really packed with a lot of stuff. So some of these forms are just 1 or 2 pages. There's definitely forms on here that I probably missed, but I really wanted to just keep it on a high level and put the forms in here that you're going to deal with most commonly, especially in your first couple of transactions for the newer agents. So here's a list of them. I'm going to open up a zip forms folder next and share that screen, and we're just going to go through each form. But as I mentioned last week, all the forms, the CAR forms, have abbreviation. So SCO, ADM, RRRR. They call this the pirate form. It's kind of a silly name with a bunch of R's, but PED, everyone's favorite, BIE, BIW, and Karina, if we go through this and you think there's something that I was super important that I missed, please let me know and we can jump into it in zip forms. But before we dive into the forms, does anybody have any questions or comments or anything in general about forms or questions from last week about zip forms or the RPA? No. All right. So here we go. Let me pull up a zip forms window. Oh, that's not what I wanted. Sorry, didn't have my screen share quite set up like I wanted. All right, so went through the RPA, filled out the offer. You submit the offer to the listing agent. You're waiting for a response. There's a few different things that can happen. We kind of went through last week. One, worst case scenario, you just get straight rejected. Hopefully the best situation with that is the listing agent actually calls you and takes the time to tell you didn't get your offer accepted, but it's super helpful when the agent actually gives you some information on why your offer didn't get accepted, because then you can take that to your buyer and one, they just, they really want to know why they didn't get it in the first place. But two, if you were pushing them to maybe make a more aggressive offer and they thought they were good where they're at, and then you can come back and tell them, hey, there was 9 offers and we were the second from the bottom, that helps them realize that maybe they do need to be more aggressive, or maybe they do need to listen to you more. Or if you get information on all the winning offers had contingencies waived, things like that, it's just helpful information to bring back to your buyer when you don't get offer accepted. They'll definitely appreciate it. It makes you seem a little more professional, and it'll help you certainly in writing the next offer, because it's just going to give them kind of a point of reference on why they didn't get them accepted, and maybe it'll change their thinking when it comes to the next offer. So again, worst case scenario, you just get straight rejected. I think, and we've talked in the earlier sessions about building rapport with the listing agent. When you get that call from the listing agent, I think it speaks to how good of a job you did kind of trying to build a relationship with that agent. Obviously sometimes when there's 19 offers, their listing agent's probably not going to personally call through every single one. But I always feel like when the listing agent calls me and takes the time to actually have a 2-minute conversation and give me some information, it means they appreciated the time that I put in leading up to submitting the offer, in trying to get as much information as possible and establish myself as a professional and do what I can to get that offer accepted. So if you're going to get your offer rejected, at least hopefully you can get some information from the listing agent that you can bring back to your clients. Other scenario, best case scenario, is they just straight up accept the offer. When we went through the RPA, we saw on kind of the last pages where the seller can just sign the offer and initial all the pages. And if they sign the offer as is, the way that the RPA is structured, once all parties have signed, the buyer sign when they submit, the seller sign, and then it actually takes the confirmation of receipt on the buy side. So either you or the buyer is signing or initialing that they've confirmed that the seller's accepted the offer. That's what creates, a binding agreement. But if they're just straight up accepting the offer as is, then the RPA itself will create the contract. So best case and worst case scenarios there. Hopefully the best case is what you deal with more often, but chances are sometimes you're going to get a counter offer. So there's a few different ways that counter offer scenarios can play out, and there's a few different forms that go along with the different scenarios. So the first one is the seller counter offer form. Loading form. I tried to download like a giant PDF with all of this and just have it so I could scroll down, but it wasn't quite as organized as I hoped. So I'm just gonna hopefully just going through it in zip forms like this works. Now we're stuck on loading. Come on. Seriously. Zip forms. Imagine if you're trying to write an offer right now. You guys are still there, right? It's just zip forms frozen. My Zoom didn't like completely crash.
Yes, we're here.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna see if this might be a little more cumbersome, but if this is gonna be slow, I'm just gonna pull up PDFs of this. All right. Oh, here we go. So here is the seller counteroffer form. A lot of the forms that we're gonna deal with today are, like I was saying, a lot more straightforward and just shorter because there's usually a very specific purpose for using the form. So there's not a whole ton packed in there, whereas the RPA has, a million different things that it covers. Obviously, the title on this form, you want to make sure you're using the right form. Some of these forms are helpful because they'll have little notes because this will say may not be used as a multiple counteroffer. Using the correct forms, it's a little thing, but we've talked about attention to detail and the importance of that. Using the correct forms for what you're trying to accomplish as far as the mechanics of the transaction is super important. One, because if you use the wrong form, it might not actually do what you're intending it to do. And two, it's just always a bad look when you get forms for another agent and they're not filled out properly, or they're the completely wrong form for what they're trying to do. So being educated as to how these forms work and the purpose of them and when to use them and when not to use them is super important. So just pay attention to what you're doing. And again, if you're never sure, refer to the leadership team. The date, as we talked about on the RPA, is important because it gives a point of reference for the forms. And if you're ever referring to the form in another form, the date is going to be how you identify it. And a lot of the forms that we're going to go through today are going to have this same information on the top, because these are this first paragraph is what incorporates these forms into the transaction. So this is a counteroffer, and in this case, you would check purchase agreement because this is a response to an offer. We're going to get to buyer counteroffer in a little bit because you can kind of go back and forth with counteroffers, seller counteroffers, and buyer counteroffers. I would say, at least in my experience, that's less common these days. A lot of agents would probably say that even just getting a counteroffer seems like it's happening less often. And in these multiple offer scenarios, I think that it's because, people are just sick of losing and get really aggressive. And when there's somebody that just stands out, far above all of the other offers, then there's no need for a counter because, one of the offers is going to stick out. But if your offer is up there, but it's just missing something that the seller would like to see, then you're going to get a seller counteroffer form. So this is different from the multiple counter, because the multiple counter means that they're countering obviously multiple people. If you get a seller counteroffer form, then, if everything's doing things how they're supposed to, then you're the only buyer getting countered. So, and I always talk about scenarios in reference to multiple offer situations, because chances are that's what you're going to experience more than just, you're the only one writing an offer. But, if there's no other offers or it's not a ton of competition, then you're going to be the only one getting a counter. So you'll get on this seller counteroffer form. Back to this paragraph, this just has the basic terms that incorporate it. So it's what a document that it's part of, and then the date, referring back to the date of the document. So if it's in conjunction with the purchase agreement, it's going to have the date of that purchase agreement. And then obviously property address, buyer, and seller. These are just identifying that all the parties and the important terms of the contract or the transaction. So this form becomes part of it. And then terms. So the terms and conditions of the above referenced document are subject to the following. paragraphs in the offer that require initials by all parties, but are not initialed by all parties. I mean, these are things you can just read through, but it's basically just explaining the form. And then other terms, this is where the seller would put what they're countering. So these first couple paragraphs are basically saying everything in the original offer is incorporated into this, but these other terms are going to be on top of that. So, or incorporated on top of that. So say you had a 15-day inspection contingency and the seller was countering, your offer was good, but the seller wanted a shorter inspection contingency, they would write that in under other terms, inspection contingency to be 7 days or whatever they're countering would be written out here, and even price. So sometimes they'll just say like, highest and best price. Usually they'll like put a number on things because they had something in mind. So you wrote an offer for $850 and then, they're trying to squeeze you to $875. So they would write purchase price to be $875, but basically whatever terms they're trying to get you to change your offer to would be written into other terms. And that would be, the heart of the counteroffer would be in this other term section. If they're going to attach any addenda or forms, if they have, some reason they need to make it more complicated, then, they'd have boxes checked here. Expiration is self-explanatory. It's just like on the offer. It's when the counteroffer expires. Typically, when you're in, negotiation scenarios, there's going to be shorter expiration on things. By default, it's just like the offer. It goes to 5 p.m. on the third day after it's signed. But more often than not, when you're negotiating, they're going to have, 24 hours or less. And at this point, if you're in these situations, you're communicating with the agent, and a lot of the times the agent's going to call you before they send a counter and kind of talk about what to expect, what your buyer might be open to. I would say that it's fairly rare that you'll send an offer and then the first thing you hear back is, you get a counter offer with some terms in it. More often than not, the agent's going to call you and kind of feel you out and feel your buyers out and see, if a counter offer is even something that they want, which, often you'll kind of indicate that early on in the process if your offer is your final offer, if there's room there. But usually before you get this form filled out, there's some discussion between you and the listing agent, and then you'll get a form that goes along basically with what you discussed, because it's the whole goal of this is to be efficient and not waste people's time. And if they're going to counter you for $100,000 more, but there's no chance of that, but there is room there, it's a lot easier sometimes to do some of the negotiation verbally. Obviously, that doesn't mean anything, but it just saves time than sending counteroffer and countering the counteroffer and then replying to that counteroffer before you have anything. It just makes everyone's life easier if there is just one counter and then you can make a decision based on that. So you read through this stuff. The key thing with this counteroffer form is once you receive this counteroffer, it should, like we discussed last week, come with the RPA attached to it. And if your buyers sign this, then they're essentially at that point creating a contract, because the sellers have signed the contract subject to the attached counteroffer. And if they submit this with it and your buyers sign it, again, there's that confirmation of acceptance this time on the seller side that's needed to really create that binding agreement. But basically once the buyers sign this, when it's incorporated with the RPA, that creates a contract. So it's important to explain that to your buyers too, because when they have something in front of them that they can sign and create a contract versus like, okay, do we want to nickel and dime them and, counter this counter with something to change some tiny little term, or do we just want to sign it and make it a deal right here? So a lot of the times when you're doing things verbally, it's the decision-making process in terms of the buyer or the seller is different than if they have something that they can just sign and create something right there. Like someone might think, you've got a property that's on the market for a while. You might ask the listing agent if the seller would take, hey, would they take $10,000 below asking? The listing agent might say no chance. But if they have an offer in front of them that they can sign and be done with the whole thing, and it's $10,000 below asking, there's a lot more weight to that. So when you have these documents that create contracts, it really influences the decision-making process on the part of the buyer or seller. So the counteroffer is one of those forms where signing it creates a contract. So there's a lot of weight to this form. So you get your offer countered, your buyers are agreeable to the terms, you sign this, and they could, once they confirm it, it's a binding agreement. Basically, once you sign it, you're safe to assume you're going to move forward. Say there's something in the counteroffer your buyer doesn't like, or they want to, it's price and they want to try to split the difference or change some term of the counteroffer. You would check this box. We accept it subject to the attached counteroffer, and then you would create a buyer counteroffer, which I'm going to pull up when Zip Forms gets it together, but it's a very similar form to the seller counteroffer in that, you check some boxes to incorporate it with these forms, and then you write in the terms that you would want, and then you send it back to them. And it works the same as the seller counter in that if they sign the buyer counteroffer, which is subject to the seller counteroffer and the RPA, then that creates an agreement. So you could see how it can kind of go back and forth with multiple counters, but that doesn't happen very often because, again, usually you have some kind of relationship with the listing agent at this point, and you're talking things through. That won't always be the case. Sometimes everything's going to be done straight, through these forms and back and forth negotiation. But again, I would say that it makes everyone's life easier if you can kind of come to terms verbally and then see what happens with the buyer. It's important to note too that when you have those conversations, and this is going to come down to, this is getting more away from forms and just getting more in like strategy and how you communicate with your clients. When you have those conversations about terms of an offer or a counter and all that, I think it's important to know that, like, when you're discussing with the clients, like nothing's really solid until it's on paper. So I always try to be really like general, like, the listing agent might say, okay, we're going to send you a counter offer and it's going to be for $20,000 more, and reduce your contingencies to 7 days. Like, when I relay that to my buyers, I'll tell them everything, but I try to make it a little more general. Like, hey, instead of saying, hey, we're going to get a counter for $20,000 more, I'll tell them they're going to counter us for a reasonable amount more. We don't exactly know what, but they're going to put it in a counter offer. Because that listing agent might have that conversation with you, and when they go to fill out that document with the seller might say, hey, let's try to squeeze them for 35 instead of 20. And so you'll get that document, and it could be different from what you discussed because, again, verbal negotiations don't mean anything. And if you tell your buyer exactly what to expect just based on a conversation, it could be trouble. So I like to, when I'm relaying information that was discussed verbally, I like to make it a little bit more general and defer to waiting for the actual documents, because it's not always going to be the exact same as what you discussed, and you don't want to set yourself up to have to backpedal, or you don't want to create expectations on your client's part, and then you're going to get forms and they're going to have to make a decision based on something different than the expectation that you've already set. So hopefully that makes sense. It's like a kind of a nuanced thing, and just communicating with your clients through a transaction, because at this point too, like, the nerves and the emotions can be kind of high because they're on the verge of getting an offer accepted. So you got to handle those situations delicately, because they're could be pretty stressed out because they're very close to excited, but also stressed out, because even when people are excited to get the house they want, it means that the ball's rolling and they got to start not figuring out, but that really, it makes it more real that they're going to be spending hundreds of thousands, if not $1 million on a home. So the communication at this point in the transaction is it's really important that you're careful in how you communicate things. So Zip Forms is a great time to not work quickly. So if you give me a second here, I'm going to try to just make it easier. Karina, anything to add on the whole counter process?
That once it's signed, you know, that's the signature date that we use to kind of start escrow, but you have to deliver it to the other side. So sometimes it takes a listing agent a while to get it to you, a day or two. So we like to use that date and have it delivered the same day, but sometimes the listing agent lags and then you've got extra time, you know, taken away from your escrow. It's not technically a done deal until you as the buyer's agent receive that signed copy.
Yeah, and that's why when the confirmation acceptance, like when they, you know, the other side signs or your buyer signs, say they accept the counter, I always ask like, hey, can you send back a confirmed copy as soon as possible? Because then that way that shows the delivery and then it creates that binding agreement. And you know, on the other side of that, I always try to, especially because you can just sign, if you're authorized, you can be the confirming party. So, you know, when I get an accepted offer, I always try to confirm it as soon as possible and just send it back, just because it's good practice to be on top of that. Because you know, you want agents on the other side to do the same. So, all right, I'm gonna see if we can do this through PDFs. I don't know where this address came from, but this is what the buyer counter offer looks like. Just real quick, it's very similar to the counter offer. It's more important that you just understand kind of the mechanics of it. So you would only be sending a buyer counter offer if you've sent an offer and then received a seller counter offer, and then you're making this buyer counter offer subject to the counter offer. Important thing to remember is that it's kind of like a chain of documents. So this is a counter offer that is tied to a seller counter offer. So when you send this, you need to sign the seller counter offer, check the box that you're incorporating another counter offer, and send that over. Because if you didn't send this over, if you skip the your buyer's signing the seller counter offer, then this document technically is just kind of like floating out there on an island and isn't properly incorporated in the transaction because it's not chained to the purchase agreement. And you know, when you go to open escrow and you send them all the contract docs, like the final price that you agree to might be on this buyer counter offer, but if you're missing a form that pulls this into the agreement, then you're gonna have to go clean it up and get it signed. So it's just important to make sure you understand how the documents all link together and create a contract that incorporates the terms of all the documents. So hopefully that makes sense, but if it doesn't, you know, when you get in the situation, just make sure you talk to Karina or myself or Elias and just make sure that you're doing the paperwork right, because again, you're creating contracts here. So, okay, we're skipping over to the seller multiple counter offer. So this is a situation that if you haven't been in, I'm sure you've heard about. There's 10 offers, whatever. And there's a couple of offers at the top that are pretty close. There's not one that stands, you know, head and shoulders above all of the other ones. So the sellers decided to make a multiple counter offer, or there is one that stands out, but the seller is going to just try to squeeze as much as they possibly can from all these potential buyers. So they do a counter offer and try to pit people against each other. This is when you get one of these, it's safe to assume that other offers have gotten countered also. And again, typically at this point, you've had some kind of conversation with the listing agent and you have some idea of what's going on. You usually hear from the listing agent as far as, you know, how many people got countered, you know, what the seller's expecting, all that. So the alternative to a regular counteroffer is a multiple counteroffer, and there's multiple parties involved. In a lot of ways, that it's similar to the seller counteroffer and just how it's structured. It's going to be incorporated into the RPA. It's going to have the terms here that the seller wants the buyer to step up to. But the big distinction between the seller counteroffer and the multiple counteroffer is that when you sign the seller counteroffer, you've got a done deal. Like you're creating, again, they have to get it confirmed. I'm going to stop referring to that. Just remember that, that you have to get it confirmed. But when you sign a seller counter offer, it creates that agreement between the buyer and the seller. When you sign a multiple counter offer, there's still another step before a contract's formed, in that the seller needs to select this multiple counter offer. So if you could look down at this box here that's in bold or outlined, it's the selection of the multiple accepted counter, and that's the one that you want signed, because you can agree to the terms that the seller has in this counter and sign it and send it back, but you're waiting on them to select your multiple counter and send it back. Another thing that's important to note when you explain this to your sellers is that the seller doesn't necessarily have to counter everybody the same thing. It's not like they fill out this form and just send it to 5 buyers. They could be countering, they want you to remove your inspection contingency. So they could counter you, just remove all contingencies, and they could counter someone else that's a lower offer, purchase price to be whatever the highest offer is, say that's you, and remove contingencies or whatever. There's going to be different terms potentially for different offers. Or it could just be, they want your highest and best purchase price, and they want you to respond and create or step up your offer, and then they want to see what the highest is. This multiple counter offer is the form that's used when the seller wants to just go back to everybody and say, hey, like, now you're competing with 3 other people. You've made it farther in the process, but what can you do to improve your offer and make it stand out above the rest? So, going more to the strategy and the negotiating side, there's different ways you could play this. Depends on how strong you feel like your initial offer was. And it also, stresses the importance of the relationship between you and the listing agent, because just because you get a multiple counter offer doesn't necessarily mean you're going to change something. If you're really strong and the seller's just trying to squeeze the other buyers, you might not need to do anything, because if you're confident that other people can't step up and do what you did, then you could just leave it the same. Or if you want to just do a little something to make it a little stronger, then you talk to your clients about that. Or you could be way off and you're $50,000 below the highest offer, but they liked your terms or whatever. They liked how your offer was presented, and you presented yourself as an agent that the listing agent and sellers would like to work with, but your offer's not just quite there. Then this could be a chance to step your offer up and make it competitive with the better offers out there, and maybe get selected. So there's a lot of different ways that this could kind of play out, but it's important for your buyers to understand that just because they agree to the terms of the multiple counter offer, then doesn't mean the seller still needs to select it. The other thing is that these multiple counter offers all get sent out, and the seller's not under any obligation to like wait for a response to these counter offers. Normally a seller probably would want to see what everybody else has before they make a selection, but they're not obligated to. And that's really important that your clients understand that, because if 5 of these counter offers go out to other parties and your clients want to sleep on it and decide, if they really want to pay more, or if they want to risk removing contingencies, somebody else could respond 10 minutes after getting a counter offer with a sweet change in terms that the seller really likes. And the seller, again, is not obligated to get all the responses. They could select that counter offer right there, have an agreement, and then at that point, your clients are out.
Just
Super
want to hammer home here that the seller multiple counter offer, the terms do not need to be the same for every single person that gets countered. They can be uniquely different. A lot of agents just kind of do like a blanket thing, like highest and best terms, something like that. But just so this question comes up a lot. People say, does it have to be the same counter to everyone to make it fair? There's no fair.
Yeah, there's no fair at this point. Like, the seller's in the ideal situation where they can pit people against each other even more that really want it. So there's no fair. And I always, because a lot of people think like, well, we'll just wait for a counter, or we'll do this. Like, especially if they have some, they feel like they have leverage and they have room to work with on price, or they could waive the appraisal. You really got to coach your clients from the beginning that you can't expect any negotiations, especially in the super fast-paced competitive market. you can't kind of, in multiple offer situations, if a property's been sitting for 30 days, you can kind of slow play that and go through a little more negotiating. But if you're competing with 15 other people, who knows where those people are in the process, you really have to coach your clients to be aggressive. If they assuming they really want the house, they need to be aggressive and not try to slow play things. And the example I always use, and this is just something that hits home with me, and it's important, I think, and helpful when you find little stories and examples when you're trying to coach your clients on things, when you can find little stories and examples to help them understand things. But when the Warriors were for sale, it was a while ago now, Larry Ellison, the guy who owns Oracle, who's like super rich, made an offer and like lowballed a little bit. I mean, lowball is still like billions of dollars. Lowballed a little bit. Somebody else made a better offer. They went with that other offer, and then Larry Ellison was pissed because like he didn't get a chance to counter it, and like he would have paid more than the other people paid, but they didn't counter him. And so basically, that's an example of someone going into negotiations expecting a counter and trying to not to put their best offer forward, and he lost out on his chance. So I think it's a good illustration of you can't depend on a counter, and even if it means risking whatever overpaying might mean or being more aggressive than you have to, it's better than losing an opportunity to get the house you really want. So just hammering when you're in a multiple counter situation to your buyers that if they really want the house, they're getting really close if they've gotten countered, but they've got to step up. Hammering that home is super important. So does anyone have any questions at this point? I know we're just kind of this more lecture style, but the whole counter offer and multiple counter scenario is something that I know can be, intimidating, and it's something that you're potentially going to deal with quite a bit if this market stays the way it is. So somebody ask a question about a multiple counter scenario so we can kind of talk about it more. No, nothing. Anyone?
I got a question, John. If
Yes,
you were
sir.
to if you're working with a seller and you have a lot of offers come in, and there are some offers that you go with your buyers or your sellers, do you have to confirm receipt and say, hey, look, I'm not going with your offer, but my seller did look at your offer, and do they have to sign in their part, or?
That would be like best practice. I mean, I would say that customarily, or at least what's common, like it's listing agents aren't doing it. But if you can ask as a buyer's agent, you can ask that you get a rejected copy of your offer. So you may have people that want that. And if someone requests a rejected copy of your offer, then you're obligated to do it. But just because of the like formality and the time that it takes to reject all offers, it's not very common. I would say it's, maybe 1 in 10 offers that I write, the listing agent will send back the rejected offer with the seller signature. But it's fairly uncommon. I mean, it's definitely a good practice, but it's just kind of time consuming and people don't really do it.
I see. Okay, that's good to know.
Anyone else?
Do
Martha?
listing agents at least call you to tell you that your offer was rejected?
I mean, good ones do, and hopefully, again, you've created that communication, but you can't rely on it. And when you're in that period of waiting for a response on your offer, I think the best thing to do is, as soon as you submit your offer, try to get out of the listing agent when they're reviewing or when they're presenting with the seller, because obviously as an agent, like, you're on the edge of your seat waiting for a response, and this isn't even your house. So imagine how your buyers feel. Like they're just really just, every time their phone rings, they're probably hoping it's you calling to tell them it got accepted. So if you can at least tell them, find out from the agent when they're going to review, so you can tell your buyers like, hey, offers were due at 2:00 today, but they're not going to meet with the sellers until late tonight or early tomorrow morning. So the earliest we'll have a response will be, late tomorrow morning. That helps them relax a little bit. You won't always get that information, but I always try to check in with my buyers. They appreciate, no news. They appreciate like an update that's not even an update. Like if we submit an offer and it gets to be 6 or 7 o'clock and I haven't heard anything from the listing agent, I don't know when they're reviewing, I'll reach out to my buyers and say, hey, like just checking in to let you know I haven't heard anything yet. They do have some time to respond. I'm not sure when they're reviewing, but I just want to let you know that I haven't heard anything, and as soon as I do, you'll reach out, you'll hear from me. So just stay in touch. It's part of being professional and part of just communicating with them. But with no, you won't always get a phone call. Worst case scenario is you get nothing. Best case scenario is a phone call. Somewhere in between is like a you know, an email or a mass email to all the people that didn't get accepted, but at least they let you know. I mean, I have stories where you don't hear it all, or you have to proactively reach out. But you know, don't be shy. And if your buyers are hassling you for a response, don't be shy and calling and texting the listing agent and trying to find out when you're going to get a response, because you know the good ones and the professional ones won't mind, and they'll want to communicate that anyway. Just to share, I had like a grudge against this big Oakland listing agent for a while, and it was funny because she owns a brokerage now and actually interviewed there a while back when Climb closed. And I told her, like, I had secretly had this grudge against her because my clients had written offer on their place. Like it was when the market was crazy, you know, years back. It's crazier now, but very similar market. It was like their second or third offer. It was one of the ones we were like really aggressive on. I think it was the first time we had like waived an inspection contingency. They were super pumped. They'd submit that offer that day. They were out to dinner with some friends, and they were telling their friends about the house, and they pulled it up on their phone to show it to them, and it was marked pending. And we had just submitted the offer like a few hours before. They hadn't heard anything. So they called me and they're like, it says pending. Like, does that mean we got it? And I said, probably not, because I would have heard, but let me find out. And the listing agent had just, you know, it was, I'm sure it was an accident because she's super nice, but her assistant or someone had just marked it pending before she had a chance to, you know, email and reach out to people. But it's just that it was a bummer of a situation to be in, because the buyers, it's a lame way to find out you didn't get a house. And you know, even if you're super professional, it's not the best look for you as an agent. So I think this is more a lesson for listing agents to like take the time to communicate to the buyers that didn't get it, because you know you've been in that situation too, and it's just so much more helpful as a buyer's agent when you get that phone call that you didn't get an offer with some information that you can come back to, because it helps soften the blow when the buyers can understand why they didn't get it. All right, so hopefully that's a fairly thorough review of what can happen with counter offers. So there's the three forms of seller counter, buyer counter, and seller multiple counter. I think I covered the key things with the counter offers situation. But to recap, the seller's not obligated to counter. The seller can counter everybody different. The seller's not obligated to wait for responses before they select a counter offer. So main thing to hammer home with counter offers is that time is of the essence when it comes to a seller counter offer or multiple counter offer, because the sellers might get something that they like and just go ahead with it before doing anything else. So that is counter. So real quick, let's see. Sorry, not as organized today with multiple forms. Trying to find addendum. All right, so I'm just going to go back to this main list. Right. Come on. All right, so addendum and amendment of existing agreement. I'm just going to skip pulling up those forms just because they're super straightforward. At the top, they have the same thing these other forms do, where it has the form that they're incorporated to with, and the property address and the date and the buyers and sellers. Addendums are going to be used for a wide variety of things. It's anytime you're adding a term or condition to the contract, it's typically on an addendum. You can have multiple addendums. So addendum is one of the forms where it'll say addendum number and then it'll be blank. And then you each time you create a new addendum, you just add to that sequence. I have amendment of existing agreement on here just because I want to clarify the difference between an amendment and a addendum. Most of the times you're going to be using an addendum to add something to the forms, but every once in a while you'll come across a situation where you need to use the amendment. And the main distinction is an amendment is when you're changing something that's like already agreed upon. Like these almost never come up, and I probably wouldn't have put it in here if it didn't recently come up in that, on the buyer's offer, the county was missing from the address, and it came up during a sky slope review that the county was missing. And I think it's a good time to point out that like when they're reviewing, like they're reviewing, they're not just making sure you have all the forms, like they're checking to make sure that they're completed properly. And in the EXP review, they noticed that the county was missing on the purchase agreement. We were already a week into the transaction, and so they needed to amend that the county onto the offer. And since that document was already like signed by both parties, it was amending an existing agreement. When you're adding an addendum to something, say you're adding an addendum to the offer that you're writing, or you're adding an addendum to incorporate some terms in a counter or request for repair, nothing's been agreed upon yet. So when they sign the addendum, that's when the agreement is created. The distinction when you use amendment is when you're modifying something that's already been agreed upon. So hopefully that makes sense. They're pretty straightforward. The addendum is very much a kind of catch-all form that can be used in a lot of different situations.
Just adding on here, the amendment of existing agreement, EXP wants it more than any other brokerage I've ever worked with. They're pretty AEA happy. So just keep that in mind if you're stuck on which one should you use, addendum or amendment, like hit either me or John up to make sure that you've got it right, because it's a pain getting it signed twice by your buyers when it's basically the same form. But again, addendum is when it's not agreed upon. Amendment is after it's already agreed upon.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I actually had never, I'm almost certain in my years doing this, I'd never used an AEA, and it came up on my first EXP transaction, and they specified like they wanted it. So county's missing. It was in one of those sky slope reviews in the notes, like county's missing on the RPA, address this using an AEA. So yeah, it sounds like Karina's got lots of experience with EXP requesting AEAs, so good to know. All right. Oh, I don't know what I just did. Just gonna pull up seller in possession form. So this is the form that you use. So you'll hear a lot. The sellers want to rent back. Sellers, need 2 weeks, need 29 days. Or just basically the seller needs to remain in the property. That would be incorporated into the agreement by using a seller in possession form. So I'm going to try to pick up the pace a little bit because we have a few more forms covered in 30 minutes. So, I'm going to defer to having you read through these agreements, and then I'll just kind of talk about key points. But the seller in possession is the form that you would submit with an offer. Normally you would submit it with an offer, and this is your way to say like, okay, the seller can stay for 15 days. And these are the terms that the seller is going to be doing that under. So obviously term, this is going to say how many days. So you'd either put in the number of days or you'd put in a specific date. Consideration. So you would put in, you read through this form, and this is going to say how much they pay. So if they're going to do X amount per day, or if you're going to do a total amount. So I would say that it's fairly common that when your buyers are offering the seller a rent back, they're doing it at no cost. So you would say like $0 per day. I'm not sure if it lets you put zero. What I usually do if it's at no cost is I check this box and write at no cost. Karina, what do you like to see as far as?
It doesn't let you put in zero.
Okay.
So sometimes in Zip form or in DocuSign, when you get there, you can type in zero, or like you said, at no cost.
Yeah.
Whichever. The default is nothing if you don't check anything, but some people like to see that in there. And And then if you were to choose, do it, then you would want to check that box held in escrow that John's about to talk about.
Yeah. So then this is going to explain how the money happens. There's a couple different ways to do it. So by default, if they are going to pay, if the seller is going to pay any money, by default, the buyer just gets this money at close of escrow. It's usually a credit towards, the buyer's side of the transaction. Or you can check it and it's held in escrow. And then when the seller vacates, they agree to release it. So let's just talk about late charge. Talks about seller's obligation for maintaining the condition of property. And clients will have questions because sometimes they're going to be concerned, like, hey, is the seller going to trash the place or whatever? Like, one, it's the home they've owned and they live there. It's not like tenants, like they're not, chances are they're not going to trash it on the way out, especially when they're selling it and happy to be selling it. So this covers all that. It talks about, I'm going to talk about the delivery of possession fee in a second, but utilities, it just talks about how the buyer can still, during this period, it spells out the terms of the buyer needing to access the property. They can't assign this to someone else. The seller still needs to maintain insurance. But the delivery of possession fee is one thing to note, because it's not a security deposit, and they're very careful to not call it a security deposit, because the whole point of the seller and possession addendum is that you're not creating a tenant relationship, a landlord-tenant relationship between the buyer and the seller. And there's a reason that you only use this form for occupancies less than 30 days, because if somebody's going to be there for more than 30 days, then that does create a landlord and a tenant relationship. And there's a different form for that, which we'll get to in a second. So you only use this seller in possession form for a rent back shorter than 29 days or shorter. If it's longer than 30 days, then you need to use the residential lease after sale form. But so there's no security deposit, but there is a delivery of possession fee. So, what I put in, I usually do rent backs at no cost to seller. I advise my buyer to do that because it makes their offer a little bit sweeter. Because if the seller is, asking for a rent back, then other people are going to be doing it too, and you want to do it under favorable terms. But I do always do a delivery of possession fee. It just makes the buyers feel better. So, the amount will depend on the transaction, but you can have, in this paragraph here, 3C, you can put in an amount, say $5,000, $3,000, and that'll be held in escrow. Default, it's released to the buyer. That's a hassle because then the buyer needs to get to the seller when they move out. I always check held in escrow, and escrow companies are familiar with this. They do it all the time. So if you have $5,000 delivery of possession fee, when the transaction closes, they'll withhold that $5,000 from the seller's proceeds. And then once the party's moved out, then the both sides can instruct escrow that it's okay to release that. So again, it's important to note that it's not considered a security deposit, but it is some money that, it doesn't really spell it out, but it does give the buyer a little bit of leverage over the seller if there is some issue during that seller in possession term. So SIP forms used under 29 days. And this is where you spell out the terms of the rent back. So if you're submitting an offer and you're going to give the seller a rent back, you would put that in here. Sometimes you'll get, you might not know that they need a rent back, or they might not be sure and they want to see what the offers are first. Sometimes you'll get a SIP as part of a counter. So you'll submit an offer and you'll get on the seller counter offer, it'll say, buyer to agree to the terms of the attached SIP, and then they'll fill this out. I have one where they countered us with a rent back, and they wanted to, they're going to pay the buyers $150 a day to keep the property, and they attached the SIP to the counter, and once we signed it, it gets incorporated into the agreement. So that's the SIP form. Residential lease after sale is a little bit more complicated because it does create a landlord-tenant relationship. So that seller in possession form was 1 page, I think. The residential lease after sale is almost 10 pages because it's essentially a lease. I mean, it's a lease. So this is where you have to get really careful because you're creating that landlord-tenant relationship. And again, in these situations where the seller is selling it, it's different than a typical tenant, but one thing to think about right now is like there's a moratorium on evictions still in place in a lot of places. You could give your seller a rent back of 45 days, and then they could just stay, and they'd have to literally go through an eviction process to get the seller out. Like, seems pretty rare that that would happen, but I actually have a buddy that is literally going through this right now, to where the seller, it was complicated by coronavirus and all this other stuff, but the seller is refusing to leave a property that's already sold, and it's screwing up all kinds of stuff. So you really want to try to keep rent backs under 30 days, because it just makes the situation a lot cleaner. Beyond the 30-day period, you use this form, but it's important to note that lenders don't want rent backs over 60 days, because at that point, and this is something you can discuss with your lender, because it'll be a case-by-case basis. But if for some reason, and I would say that it's not very common, but if for some reason you're in a deal where the seller's trying to negotiate a longer term to stay, then it's something you really want to make sure that the lender is on board with and understands. Because if you submit some documentation that has this, then the lender is going to consider it. Basically, if it's over 60 days, then the lender is going to consider it a non-owner occupied property, like it's an investment property, and the terms of the loan are going to be completely different. So, the interest rate's higher, the guidelines for qualifying are higher. So you really just want to stay away from long rent backs. You might find yourself in a situation where it's totally necessary. Just make sure that you have the forms filled out properly to protect your clients, and also you have the lenders totally on board, because it could kill a deal. I'm not going to go through this. It's basically a lease. If you're doing this form, you want to go through it with myself or Karina, and just make sure that you've got yourself covered and your client really understands the agreement that they're signing. But I mean, I think the best advice that I could give you is to just do whatever you can to stay out of, rent backs longer than 30 days. But if you got to do it, you got to do it. Just make sure that your buyers understand the situations that they are putting themselves in. All right. Well, it's not in present mode anymore, but let's see. Contingency for sale of buyer's property. Ooh, this is a good one. Let's see, we have 20 minutes left. I'm going to go through I'm going to skip to the request for repair and seller response. The contingency for sale of buyer's property. Well, I'll just talk about it for real quick, but basically that's the form that you would include if your buyer needs to sell. If your buyer needs to sell a property first, before it's a tricky situation. So, one, if you have a buyer that needs to sell a property first, that's something that you're talking about early on in the process from your very first meeting, because the way that the whole process is going to be completely different for a buyer who needs to sell a property first than just a regular buyer. And even within those contingent buyers, depending on where they're at with everything, it's that it could be make it almost impossible, or very, very difficult, I should say, to get in a contract with most places out there. Or depending on where they are in the process, it could be, a small hurdle that they're going to have to overcome. But if you can present it properly to the listing agents when you're writing offers, it shouldn't necessarily be a deal killer for most properties. I'm going to talk about this real quick, but if you get into this situation and you're filling one of these forms out, again, sounding like a broken record, but talk to me or Karina, because this is a complicated form. This is more complicated than I've been saying these forms are straightforward, just read them. But this one is a pretty tricky one in the way that it's written. And it's a pretty big deal that you do it right, because you don't want to be in a situation where this is the last contingency protecting your buyer, and they're in contract to buy something, and you might have to remove this contingency and be at a point in the transaction where you're not ready. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to explain, what the form does. But if you ever need to fill one of these out, talk to me. I consider myself an expert on this form because I had a ton of contingent sales a couple years ago. They're getting tougher to do now, but you can still do them. Again, it just depends on how you prep your buyer. But if you get a buyer that thinks they can't buy because they have to sell first, or is really just scared about the process, talk to me, because how you coach them through the process, it could be the difference between them being comfortable moving forward and you get a listing and a purchase out of it, and them just wanting to wait until their situation's different. But it's totally possible. I am in the middle of one right now where their sale just closed, their purchase closes on Monday. In this competitive market, it still totally worked out. There was a point a summer a couple of years ago where they were in different phases, but I literally had 3 contingent deals going at once. So that was 6 transactions. That was 3 listings that needed to close in order for 3 buyers to close. Needless to say, it was pretty stressful because, if I was either going to close 6 deals, well, I was on a team. So the team listing agent had the listings, but we worked together on everything, but we were going to close 6, or we were going to close 2 or 4 or none. So contingent sales are tricky, but they're totally doable. So don't let your buyers be scared of them. And, if you can coach them properly, you get a listing and a purchase out of it. So it's a skill that, especially as the market gets a little bit, maybe slows down a little bit, and people that aren't scared to try to sell and buy at the same time, coaching people through the process is a good skill to have, because again, you get 2 deals out of it. So main thing with this form is there's a way to write it so it's this box right here. If this box is checked, the listing agent essentially can't have you remove this contingency. So if it's not checked, they can put you in a position where you have to remove it, or the seller can cancel. So I always check that box, and sometimes it gets countered out, sometimes it doesn't. I've been in situations where I had that box checked. The listing agent didn't understand the form because it is one of the more complicated forms, and they didn't realize until we were pretty far into the transaction that they couldn't make us remove this contingency because, again, they didn't understand the form. So to repeat myself again, if you need to deal with this form, just make sure you're 100% clear on the situation you're putting your buyers in. And it goes back to just how you coach them from the very beginning. But get good at dealing with contingent sales, because they're not as hard they're not as hard and not as complicated as they seem. All right, so 15 more minutes. We're going to do the request for repair and then response to request for repair, because those are going to be pretty common. Maybe not in every transaction you deal with, but it's going to be something that is more common than something like a seller in possession or contingency of sale of buyer's property. So here is the request for repair form. All right, so when you're going to go, you're in the contingency period, you've done some inspections, your seller wants to ask for, or your buyer wants to ask for some things from the seller. This is the form that you use. So top of it looks like all the other forms. This is a form you can have multiple of. So you put in the number up here. Top of it is just like the rest. And then here is where you put in the terms of the request. So by request, prior to the final verification and condition that seller repair take the other specified action for each item listed below on the attached list stated blank. Then there's different options here. It could be B, if they just want them to clear section 1, then you put it in here. Section 2, I don't know that anyone will ever request someone to clear section 2, but that's how you would do it here. C is buyer requests the seller credit X amount at close of escrow. So if you're just straight up asking for a credit, then you would just check that here. Or D, buyer requests that the seller reduce the purchase price to X amount. So one thing to note with credits is most lenders, credits is one of those things that when you start talking about credits, you want to make sure you run it by the lender, because most lenders only allow credits towards closing costs, and some lenders are even limit the kind of closing costs that it can be credited towards. There's recurring closing costs, which is property taxes and insurance, and then there's non-recurring closing costs, which is like your title and escrow fees. Most lenders you can apply credit towards both, but if you get one where you can't can't credit recurring closing costs, that's going to limit the amount you can credit, because the credit can't like go towards the down payment. It can only go towards the funds, the like fees and associated with the funds to close. So if the credit's going to be a big amount, then rather than the credit, then the seller needs to reduce the purchase price, because net to the seller of a $10,000 credit or a $10,000 reduction in purchase price is going to be the same thing. But the mechanics of it and how it works with the lender is important to understand, because, you know, a $30,000 credit is going to be too big for most transactions. You know, even $1 million deal, a $30,000 credit is probably too much, and you're going to need to actually, you know, credit 15,000 and reduce the purchase price 15,000 or something like that. So if you're doing credit, it's pretty straightforward. You put in the amount, or a purchase price reduction, you just put in the amount. If you're asking for specific repairs, that's where it's a little more important in how you write it. So, you know, people have their different styles. Usually if it's more than a couple of items, which, you know, you want to write clean requests. So I always try to get my sellers or buyers to focus on just the things that are super important to them. Customarily, you kind of only ask for, you have a better chance, I should say, of getting health and safety issues credited. So if it's, you know, a water heater that's on the verge of exploding because something's done wrong, or you know, something health and safety related, electrical issue with the main panel, it's done wrong. You have a better chance of getting something like that fixed than you do, you know, a sliding door latch that doesn't latch properly or something like that. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's your job to help the buyer facilitate the request. But this is something that the earlier on you kind of coach them on. One, very early on, they need to understand that the seller is not obligated to do anything. So that's important that they know. But two, like, just realizing that, you know, when you're doing inspections, the main purpose for the inspection is just so you understand, you know, what you're getting, so you know what to be aware of and what things you might need to work on in the future. The point of inspection is not to find a list of stuff that you're going to ask the seller to repair. It's going to make your life a lot easier if your buyers understand that going in. That being said, if there was information that's super relevant that comes up during inspections, then it's worth a shot at asking for a credit. Just to kind of step back a little bit, it's I don't know what word to use, but basically you don't want to ask for credits. You typically don't ask for credits or repairs for information that was disclosed up front, like as part of a disclosure package before you wrote the offer. You would just take that information into account when you submit your offer price. So if there's some electrical issues and they have a quote in there from an electrician to fix it for $5,000, you're not going to write an offer and then ask for a $5,000 credit to fix the electrical. Just offer $5,000 less. So typically you're only doing requests for repairs for things that come up that weren't known when you first entered into contract. That's important to stress to your buyers as well. So all that being said, you get a home inspection. There's a few things on there your buyer wants to ask the seller for. It's a lot cleaner, in my opinion, to just figure out, okay, you know, there's these handful of things, and try to put a ballpark price on it. Let's just ask the seller for a credit. And then when this is all said and done, you can go get a handyman or a plumber or electrician and you can get it fixed. Or maybe it's not even that big a deal to you, but you're still not stoked that something's not done right, and you're going to ask for credit anyway. And then you're just going to, you know, feel better because you got a credit, but you're not going to get it fixed. So, you know, personally, I like doing credits better than repairs. I would like to think that the listing agent is probably going to rather deal with a credit than a repair, because if they're asking for certain things, unless they're pretty straightforward, then now they have to go find vendors. There's a potential of like the repair ballooning into something else. So I think credits are just more straightforward. But if you're going to request a bunch of repairs, you would do it here. And I think the cleanest way to do it is you refer to, you know, the inspection where it came up on. So if you're going to ask that the water heater temperature and pressure release valve be routed to the outside like it should be, then I would put, like, you know, home inspection report item number 4D, correct water heater correct this item on the home inspection, or and then list it out like that. Like, make it as detailed as possible, because you also want it to be detailed so it can be really clear if it was done or not. Like, you would never just want to say like, fix this valve. Like, what does that even mean? That's going to be hard to say if it was done properly or not. So be as detailed as possible and provide as much information as possible to make it a clean request, and really just coach your buyers to focus on smaller items. Because if you can get it down and it's a reasonable list, then you have a better chance of accepting it. If you have all kinds of stuff on there and you want the buyer to fix things that are going to cost your, or seller to fix things that are going to cost your buyer $15 to fix, then you run the risk of a seller just being, offended and frustrated that your buyer is even asking in the first place, and just rejecting the whole thing just on principle because they're annoyed they asked for a million things. So really focus on the main things.
And you can ask for more than one thing. Like, you could do, of them to fix something on A and a credit and or reduction of purchase price. Like, it's not allowed. It's just, kind of looks like you're asking for the world.
Yeah.
And it's cleanest, like John said, to do the credit if you possibly can for them, because it decreases the liability to the seller and to the buyer. Because if your buyer, the seller did some shoddy work and now the buyer's taking it on, you don't know necessarily what the quality of that looks like. And then once you check that number 2, the copy of the inspections that you're citing, you're going to attach them to the email with this form. And then once the seller's in possession of them, that's now something that they would have to disclose if you were to back out from your inspection contingency here, and they were to put the home back on the market. Those are all reports that they should be including for future reference for other potential buyers that are interested.
Yeah, exactly. And that helps you get your leverage to get repairs, because they might be bummed that they need to do some $5,000 electrical work, but they didn't know that when they priced it. And if they cancel this deal and go back on the market, they're going to need to tell future buyers. So that gives you a little bit of leverage. And so an important thing to note on this. So say you negotiate through the request for repairs, and then the form that goes along with this is the seller response, the RRRRRR form. Let's see, seller response and buyer request. So the form that goes along with this is this one. And this is how, so they can either just sign this and respond. They can sign the first one that I was just showing and either just straight reject it or agree to the whole thing. If they're going to change it, then they would send this form in, and then they would put in their terms. It's kind of like the counteroffer process. They can go back and forth on these. One of the main things to take away from all this is, once you work this all out, say you just, you do these forms and you end up on a $10,000 credit, typically you'd want to include an addendum that just says seller credit buyer $10,000 towards buyer's closing costs, with all this signed, because even though having it all on these RR and RRRR incorporates it in the contract, you still need to provide something to the lender for a credit or a change in purchase price. And you don't ever want to send anything to the lender that references repairs or reports, because that could jeopardize the whole deal. So whatever you agree to on these forms, when it comes to a credit or a price reduction, also put that into addendum and have that signed by everybody, because that's what you're going to give to escrow and the lender to, that's what you're going to give to escrow and the lender to make that, for them to be able to make that change. So 4 minutes left. I'm going to go back to the request for the repair. Usually what's incorporated as part of all of this is the contingency removal. So, and I'll actually pull that form up too, but usually it's, hey, we're requesting this, and if you agree to it, then we'll remove our inspection contingency. And typically the request for repairs come in kind of towards the end of the contingency period, or when you're ready to remove contingencies, because it's kind of, contingency removal might hinge on this request. Because if they don't request it, if there's a big repair and the seller doesn't want to do it, your buyer might not want that house anymore if they have to pay for all the stuff they didn't know about. So at that point, they might back out on the deal. So that's where the contingency removal comes in. And if you look at it here, then it talks about the contingency removals here, where, the seller will agree if they sign the, if they remove the physical inspection contingency, or if they sign the attached, the attached form. And that's what just kind of gives the, gives the party leverage on making the agreement, is like, hey, we'll if you agree to this $5,000 credit, then we remove our contingency. Like, everyone can relax a little bit because we're a lot closer to making this a done deal. So the contingency removal acts as leverage on the part of the buyer, when you incorporate it with the request for repair. So I thought I had a contingency removal form, but I don't, and we're almost out of time. So where is it? Removal of, no, I don't have it. All right, so 2 more minutes. Didn't get through everything we wanted, but I think we did cover the main forms. The counteroffer forms and sell in possession and request for repairs are going to be some of the main forms you deal with. And then beyond that, obviously, if you're newer, you want to go through these forms with someone experienced before you have your buyer sign them. But beyond those forms, when you get in some of the trickier forms, particularly like the contingency of sale or residential lease, or even the sell in possession, then definitely make sure you go through those with Karina, myself, Elias, or an experienced member of the team, because those are ones where the wrong box being checked or misunderstanding something can create potential disaster. So that's it for today. Anyone have any questions in the last minute? No? Comments? Concerns?
I think that was great, John. I don't know if you're gonna do like a mini intro on any of the ones that were missed, but I think the RCSD might be the only like major form that we see a lot that you didn't talk about.
Oh yeah, that's a good call. We'll there's a couple that we, buyer's inspection election and buyer's inspection waiver, I think, need to be explained. So
Yeah.
we'll figure out a time to go through those.
Yeah.
And then I'll send out something in Slack today about some labs, and maybe that'll just be more like time to just
Oh yeah, I'm on
ask
a Zoom
questions
call,
and all
dude. I
that.
ain't got time to talk. I'm on a Zoom call.
All right. Well, I've got a jam. Martha, did you have a question? I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, it was just, so when you're doing a credit, when you're asking a seller for a credit, even if it's for repairs, you don't necessarily put that it's for repairs.
You can put that it's for repairs. You just don't want to, you just also want to have an addendum, because you're going to need to explain to the seller why you're asking. You just need to also put, the credit. If they agree to it, you just need to also put it in an addendum, because that's what you're going to send to everybody to show the credit, not necessarily the forms that you worked out, the repair forms that you worked the credit out on.
To make it clear, this is the negotiating part, this RR and the RRR. Neither one of those goes to escrow or the lender. You'll get a very clean addendum together after all this is hammered out that says seller shall credit buyer $5,000 toward closing costs, or whatever you've agreed upon. But again, none of this messy back and forth goes to the lender.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Okay, thank you.
Sweet. Well, thanks everybody. I hope everyone has a great Monday ahead of them, and we will see you next time.
Yeah, good job, John.
Thanks, Jonathan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, you guys too.